Hi, welcome back to Wisdom for the Church. Thank you for watching. I am John. We'll go ahead and get back into it. This video, I wanted to cover a well-known former preacher, teacher, theologian, blogger, and other things, a conference speaker, and that is the well-known John Piper. John Piper, who is one of the foremost known Calvinistic teachers in American Christianity, alongside probably John MacArthur. The reason I wanted to do a video on John Piper is his name has kind of crossed my path more recently in videos, some people that I know, things written about him. And so it really got me thinking about John Piper and why I think it would be helpful to give you guys my take on this teacher is because he is so, one, well-known, and two, polarizing. And so I thought I could offer some insight onto what I believe are some good ways to categorize him. And so what I'll do is basically three things. One, give what I believe is like a theory on how overall Piper is viewed. And based on that, I'll do 2 and 3. Number 2 will be give what I believe are his positives or strengths, things that I think are worthy of commendation regarding John Piper. But also I will give what I believe are his weaknesses, things that I would really advise you to steer clear from in his ministry. And so I'll start off with what my working theory of John Piper is. My working theory is basically that John Piper is just a polarizing figure, a basically polarizing figure. And he will either be seen as, is often seen as, presented as either the greatest theologian since sliced bread or possibly not even a Christian to some people. So again, I'm being a little bit exaggerating here, but either he is really great theologian or we do not like him at all. Get him out of my home. I don't want his book. I don't want anything. I don't want to hear video or radio or anything regarding John Piper. And my theory on why bird's eye view he is so polarizing, most people I talk to, it stems basically down to one issue and one issue only, and that is Calvinism. Calvinism. If you are someone that leans toward or is Calvinistic, that is in your soteriology, the doctrine of salvation, how someone becomes saved and comes to know Christ. If you are a Calvinist, meaning that you believe that God from first to last is sovereign in salvation from eternity past to bringing by his power a man to Christ, and the only thing the man had to do with it was his sin and placing his faith only by the power of Christ, by the way, in the Lord Jesus through the power of the Spirit, then you lean toward a Calvinistic idea of salvation. And so you'd probably appreciate John Piper, one of the most famous Calvinists regarding the doctrine of salvation. But if you're someone who does not like that, does not think it's biblical, and you think, well, it's really unfair that God would elect some and not others, and they have no chance because their hearts are dead, as we see the language in the New Testament, you think that's unfair, you think that's not what the New Testament actually teaches, then you're going to hate John Piper because everything that he writes and thinks and says is colored by that framework of Calvinism. And so that's the basic idea for me. He's polarizing. One way or the other. You hate him, you love him. Why? He's a Calvinist. And I don't want to fall into either one of those poles. And so I'll give what I believe is some good things about his ministry, but also some things that I really do not believe are helpful and actually have become a little bit hurtful toward the church. I'll start out with the helpful. So one reason I appreciate John Piper is actually is based on context, and the context is American evangelicalism the last 30 years. Basically, the way that I see American evangelicalism, American Christianity in general, the last 30 years, it is essentially, in terms of its major exports, major media, major relevance, major churches where people bottleneck to and they get large crowds. Not always, and it's not so simple as this, but often it is the megachurch model that will, to some degree, water down the gospel into either just some therapeutic message about just bringing you out of your brokenness, or it is a pseudo health and wealth gospel that God exists to make you happy and healthy. So he's a therapist, he's someone who brings you a better quality of life, and that's basically it. Often it's accompanied by a pastor who is dressed down, skinny jeans, and he likes to shake what his mama gave him or whatever. These types of churches are everywhere. They're a dime a dozen, and yet they are also always the most authentic churches out there, ironically. And it has not helped the gospel very often. It has not helped American Christianity in many ways. In some ways it has, because it has brought people to the church. And even though sometimes things are watered down, I think some churches really do preach the gospel out of a true heart to bring men to Christ. But I don't believe that they always honor God in doing that. But God works despite men, not because of men. But it's a very juvenilized church model and a very juvenilized church setting, a church setting that has not really been helpful to men, particularly because it also seems pretty feminized if you ask a lot of us. And so that's the last 30 years or 40 years of context regarding the American church, just a mess. But then you get men like John Piper. The reason I appreciate him is in that context, he tried to be faithful to the scriptures and teach the fact that God is holy, and teach the fact that out of God's holiness we are debtors to him, and our sin means that much more. But therefore the condescension of Christ down to earth to bring us out of our mess and to save us from our sin, its guilt and its power, meant that much more. And so the appreciation for the gospel and for the great doctrines of faith because of that, and Christian living and so on and so forth, was that much greater, and the truth shined that much brighter. So Piper, over here you have just this juvenile, almost jokish, kind of fun, everything is just light Christianity all the time. You have a man over here who says that we are able to go deeper in our faith, and we are able to come to a greater knowledge of the truth through study of God's word. And Piper has brought so many through things like his book, Don't Waste Your Life, or things like his book, 50 Reasons Christ Came to Die, or things like his blogs, things like his videos. He has brought men to realize that there is a wonder in following Jesus. There's also a cost to following Jesus, and he has pointed them to authentic Christianity, authentic and true biblical Christianity. And so I appreciate that about John Piper. Even if I have some disagreements or whatever, I really appreciate that. And he has helped so many, and he's helped me, including me. The message, don't waste your life. That simple message. When you get over here, preachers, teachers, churches that say, God is a genie, God is a therapist who simply exists or only exists to help you live a good life here. And then you have Piper say, do not waste your life just building up wealth and toys here. That is a helpful thing, especially for young Christians who can be entrapped by the message of this world, which is just make your own name great and do the best you can for yourself. And so there's much to appreciate there. But there are areas where I would not really take a lot of advice from Piper. And in that category, I will call moral and ethical application. Moral and ethical application of the Bible, specifically in modern day, I'd say civil, political, and moral issues. So moral and ethical application. And I'll just use two examples of major things, really, in which I think that he was way off biblically, and why that's a problem for Christians. The first example is just from a few years ago regarding the virus and essentially jab mandates. I'm going to say jab mandates because I'm not sure what the regulations are for me to say. His stance on jab mandates from about 4 years ago in kind of the definitive blog post that he wrote, I thought was way off regarding what the Bible would have us do as Christians. And the reason I say that is not because John Piper was categorically wrong in the article, which I will link in the description. I don't believe he was categorically wrong. What I mean by that is categorically, he said the choice to be jabbed or not jabbed was, in fact, a Christian liberty issue. And that is correct. There is no law under God that says you must get this shot. And if the government says you must get this shot, that is outside the sphere of sovereignty that the government actually has. The government cannot tell you what color shirt to wear. The government cannot tell you when to put your kids to bed. It cannot tell you when to get a shot because that is outside the legitimate authority of what their scope is. Their scope is establishing basic order. Their scope is punishing the objectively civil evildoer, and the objectively civil good is to be rewarded. And those things are determined ultimately by the principles that we see in God's word. And so things that are outside their authority, they just have no reason to speak on, and they have no binding authority. They can give advice, but they don't give a direction. And so he was correct, in my estimation, of saying that this is actually a freedom. And I was so thankful for that. But the glaring issue in the article was really seen in how he postured the article, and I wanted to read that here. He said this: "My aim in this article is to encourage Christians to be vaccinated, if they can do so with a good conscience and judicious medical warrant. The people I have especially in view are those who are not vaccinated because of fear of being out of step with people they respect, and in step with people they don't admire. My message to them is simple: you are free." I'll read that last part again. "The people I have especially in view are those who are not vaccinated because of fear of being out of step with people they respect." My main issue with that article is not his categorical correctness, the fact that it was a Christian liberty issue, which so many Christians got wrong. The line was said over and over and over: love your neighbor, therefore get the jab. Or love your neighbor, therefore essentially put pressure on others to get the jab. When in fact, the answer was not that at all. The answer is love your neighbor, therefore respect their ability, fight for their ability to do or do not get the jab. And that was the difference. Love was not forcing a mask down someone's throat. Love was not forcing a shot in someone's arm. That's not love, that is hate. And so what is actually hate was called love. So John Piper categorically at least got it right, calling it liberty instead of law. I was very thankful for that. But what I thought was terrible in that article, and therefore terrible in his overall stance in this incredibly important time in the country and in the world, was the fact that he completely misdiagnosed or mischaracterized what the real pressure was. What he characterizes as the pressure in this article is that there were people being pressured to not get the jab. If you caught that, he was saying that this article was for people who were being pressured to not get the jab. And if you remember as far back as the, prehistoric times, I guess, 2020, there was little to no societal pressure to not get the jab, but there was tons and tons and tons of pressure to get the jab, and it's 73,000 boosters that came after it, and also 12 masks and wear a space helmet too. You better do that. And so the societal pressure was totally in the opposite direction of what he calls it, and even pressure in many churches were totally the opposite direction of what he calls it. Even if a church was way far to the right on this issue, they still said you're free to get the jab. They still said you're free to wear the mask because they, again, see biblical categories correctly and would call it Christian liberty. But in our larger society, and unfortunately many world-loving and God-not-fearing churches really took the same position that the world did, and that is, we're going to force you to do this thing which is not of God's law but is man's law. And they marred the image of God by forcing things on your body and on your face, and that was ultimately, to be honest, a sin. And so my problem with Piper was that he miscategorized what the real pressure was. Plenty of Christians and even just conscientious citizens were under pressure to get this jab, or they would lose their job. They could be fired. Their families were going to be hurt. And yet Piper is talking about this almost fantasy land out there, that there are these people facing these pressures to not do this thing, when in fact they're facing tons and tons and tons of pressure to get this jab, or else they're losing their paycheck, or else their family will ostracize them, or else, etc., etc. And Piper swung and missed on this article and on his stance, and I think that this is not just some insignificant wow he missed. I think that this is a terrible misjudgment and was not helpful at all to what people were going through. And for that, I call that really a misapplication of God's law. I call that a misapplication of a scriptural standard. He got the category right, Christian liberty, but he failed to see the sin that was actually going on in real space-time reality, and so he misdiagnosed God's law. You don't see any pointing out in his article of the sheer sin of forcing something in someone's arm, and that being a marring of the image of God. You don't see anything about forcing a mask on someone being potentially a marring of the image of God, and a God complex that was that stance during the virus. You don't see it. And so that was example number one. Example number two comes in the category of just basic Christian self-defense or civil self-defense, and in the American context, that is, the idea of firearms. And he wrote a response to something that was going on, I think, in 2015. So the context is a response to someone that was speaking about gun ownership and self-defense. And so I don't want that context to be missed, that it wasn't just some article randomly written. But again, in his article, he provides a lot of good and helpful biblical points, just as he did really in the virus article. But again, I believe that he misapplies or misdiagnoses what the actual elements are in the real world, and so doesn't get it right in terms of instructing Christians how to live. And in this example, he basically asks the question toward the end of his blog post, his article, can I shoot or should I shoot my wife's assailant? So I guess if someone is coming at his wife with a knife or something like that, should he shoot the assailant, or does he have the freedom to shoot the assailant to save her? And I'll read just a few statements he makes toward the end of that article in the specific example of someone coming after or threatening his wife. He says this: Jesus died to keep that assailant from sinning against my family. That is, Jesus' personal strategy for overcoming crimes was to overcome sinful inclinations by giving his life to pay debts and change hearts. It is no small thing that Peter based non-retaliationary suffering from unjust treatment on the atoning work of Christ as exemplary. And he goes on to quote 1 Peter 2. I realize that even to call the police when threatened, which in general it seems right to do in view of Romans 13, may come from a heart that is out of step with the mind of Christ. If one's heart is controlled mainly by fear or anger or revenge, that sinful disposition may be expressed by using the police as well as taking up arms yourself. I live in the inner city of Minneapolis, and I would personally counsel a Christian not to have a firearm available for such circumstances. I do not know what I would do before this situation presents itself with all its innumerable variations of factors, and I would be very slow to condemn a person who chose differently from me. So I appreciate that in the article, if you read it, Piper is very clear to point out the fact that Christians are to turn the other cheek. Christians are to pray for those who persecute us and to love our enemies. And basically, that boils down to, in these contexts, of not having a bloodthirsty, vengeful, angry, sinfully angry, that is, attitude toward those who are our adversaries or those who hurt us. We should not be quick to want to hurt someone. We shouldn't be thirsty to try to get vengeance that only belongs to God. But the context of those are not really in life or death situations, that is defending those who are more vulnerable than we are, in this case, our wife. Now, I'm not saying kill wife's assailant. I'm just saying stop with whatever minimal force is necessary to stop the blow. It is interesting that even when he talks about in this article the idea of calling the cops, the police, he wonders if the heart's motives are in the right place, which again, I think he is just thinking in an improper category. I think a heart for real justice and a heart to see the vulnerable, in this case your wife or children, see them raised up and not harmed is a perfectly fine heart motive. And calling the cops or defending your wife does not have to come out of some bloodthirsty lust to kill an assailant, but rather it's out of seeing oneself specifically as a husband or father, as a protector, as someone who is physically given strength for a reason, as a kind of governor of one's own household. And so that example and the virus example are just two of probably many others. Again, I'm not a Piper scholar. I don't really care that much. Of just examples, though, of things that I've seen, as well as probably even some of the social justice things that I think he really misapplies and misses on some moral issues, and really leads some Christians to some wrong conclusions about basic living that would be helpful to their families, helpful in actually loving neighbor, and would not be led by maybe what I would call a false pietism, or even sometimes a false compassion. And so that's my take on John Piper. In general, three truths. Number one, he's overarchingly polarizing because of his Calvinism. Number two, my take is that I appreciate him because of his seriousness for the gospel and his bucking the trend, basically, of fun, cool, hipster, therapeutic, health and wealth kind of Christianity, juvenile Christianity. And number three, I believe there are real problems with his application of the law in real circumstances that require actual biblical thinking and application. Thank you for watching.